Consider, for a moment, the summer of 1914. In the grand ballrooms of Vienna, crystal chandeliers cast their light on waltzing couples who believed their world would last forever. The Habsburg Empire had endured for 600 years. Why would it not endure 600 more? Yet in the coffee houses of Belgrade, young Serbian men gathered in the shadows, dreaming not of empire but of liberation. They spoke in urgent whispers about freedom, about nation, about blood. Two worlds, separated by a few hundred miles, moving on trajectories that would soon intersect with catastrophic force. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand understood, perhaps better than most, that his empire was fragile. He had travelled widely, seen the tensions, heard the whispers of discontent. His wife Sophie, the woman he loved against his uncle's wishes, stood beside him as they rode through Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. It was their wedding anniversary. It was also a Serbian national day of mourning. The first bomb missed. It bounced off their car and exploded beneath the vehicle behind them. The Archduke could have left, should have left, but he insisted on visiting the wounded in hospital. A wrong turn, a moment's confusion. And there, on a street corner, stood 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip with a pistol. 2 shots. That is all it took to begin unravelling civilization. The news reached Emperor Franz Joseph at his summer palace. 84 years old, he had buried his only son to suicide, his wife to an assassin's blade, and his brother to execution in Mexico. Now his nephew and heir lay dead in Sarajevo. The old emperor had seen revolution in 1848, had fought wars in Italy and Prussia, had ruled longer than most men live. He was tired, so very tired, but there were protocols, there were allies, there were promises made in glittering ballrooms when the world seemed eternal. Austria-Hungary delivered an ultimatum to Serbia, 48 hours to comply with demands so severe they were designed to be rejected. In Belgrade, the Serbian government read the terms and understood they faced a choice between honour and survival. They chose honour, accepting most demands but not all. It was enough. It was more than enough. But it was not everything. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II cut short his Norwegian cruise. The telegram reached him on his yacht, and he immediately ordered the ship to turn for home. The Kaiser was a complicated man, grandson of Queen Victoria, cousin to half the crowned heads of Europe, but insecure in ways that would prove devastating. His generals presented him with plans they had refined for decades. The Schlieffen Plan, a bold stroke through Belgium to knock France out of the war before Russia's vast armies could fully mobilize. Belgium was neutral. Belgium's neutrality was guaranteed by treaty. But the German generals spoke of military necessity, of the mathematics of mobilization, of timetables that once started could not be stopped. The Kaiser, surrounded by men in spiked helmets covered in medals, signed the orders. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II exchanged frantic telegrams with his cousin King George V of Britain and his cousin Kaiser Wilhelm. Willie and Nicky, they called each other. These men who ruled 3 of the world's great empires. Their correspondence reads like a tragedy where everyone knows what is coming but cannot stop it. "I foresee that very soon I shall be overwhelmed by the pressure forced upon me," wrote Nicholas. The pressure was real. His generals demanded mobilization. His ministers spoke of Slavic honor and Russian prestige. The Tsar, that gentle man who loved his family more than power, who would have been happier as a country gentleman than an emperor, signed the mobilization order. Once he did, the machinery of destruction engaged like gears in a vast clock, each movement forcing the next. Germany mobilized, France mobilized. The web of alliances, woven over decades in the belief they would preserve peace through deterrence, instead ensured that every nation would be dragged into the abyss. In Paris, men kissed their wives goodbye at train stations. They packed their uniforms, checked their rifles, and departed singing. The boulevards echoed with the Marseillaise. Young men rushed to recruiting stations, afraid the war would end by Christmas before they could taste glory. The French remembered 1870, when Prussia had humiliated them, taken Alsace-Lorraine, proclaimed the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles itself. Now was the time for redemption, for honour, for revenge dressed in the noble garb of patriotic duty. Across the Channel, Britain hesitated. Yes, there were treaties, but was Belgian neutrality truly worth a continental war? The cabinet debated while Europe mobilized. Then Germany invaded Belgium, and Britain's choice was made. Britain's tiny professional army, the finest soldiers in Europe, prepared to cross the Channel. The British Expeditionary Force numbered only 100,000 men, but they were veterans, skilled with rifle and bayonet, contemptuous of the conscript armies they would face. In homes across Britain, families enjoyed one last peaceful August bank holiday. Children played on beaches, couples picnicked in meadows. The weather was glorious, the sun warm on faces that did not yet know how to fear poison gas or artillery barrages. The newspapers spoke of German atrocities in Belgium, of duty and honour, and young men lined up to enlist. They thought they knew what war meant. They had no idea. Far to the east, in Constantinople, Enver Pasha made calculations that would transform the conflict into something truly global. The Ottoman Empire had been the sick man of Europe for a century, losing territory, losing prestige, losing the respect it once commanded when its armies reached the gates of Vienna. But Germany offered alliance, offered support, offered hope, that the empire might be reborn. The decision was made in secret. On October 29th, 1914, Ottoman warships bombarded Russian ports in the Black Sea. The act seemed small compared to the vast battles raging in Europe, but it would lead to campaigns in Palestine and Mesopotamia, to the Armenian genocide, to Lawrence of Arabia leading Arab revolts across deserts, to consequences that would reshape the Middle East in ways that still echo today. But in August, all that lay ahead, unknowable and terrible. The young men departing from train stations across Europe carried flowers in their rifle barrels. They sang songs, they wrote letters home promising to be back by Christmas. In their knapsacks they carried photographs, lucky charms, small testaments. They believed in glory, they believed in honour, they believed their cause was just and God marched with them. Every nation believed God was on their side. In Vienna, the cafes where intellectuals debated philosophy and artists sketched new visions fell silent as men departed for the front. The Viennese waltz, that graceful dance that had conquered ballrooms from Paris to St. Petersburg, would soon seem like an echo from another world. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a patchwork of a dozen nationalities held together by an old emperor's will and centuries of tradition. Czechs and Croats, Slovenes and Slovaks, Germans and Hungarians, all marched under the double-headed eagle. But many marched with divided hearts, and some would soon ask why they fought for an empire that was not quite their home. In Russia, peasants were called from fields to fight for a Tsar most had never seen, for an empire that kept them in conditions little changed from serfdom. They came because the Tsar commanded, because the Church blessed the war, because there was no choice. The Russian army was vast, its soldiers hardy, its generals brave, but it was also poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and led by men who mixed competence with aristocratic privilege in dangerous proportions. The German armies that surged toward Belgium and France were different. Here was military efficiency perfected, years of training and planning about to be tested. The Schlieffen Plan was elegant in its ambition. Wheel through Belgium, swing around Paris like a closing door, trap the French armies against their own fortifications, win the war in 6 weeks. Then turn east to deal with Russia before its mobilization completed. It almost worked. The irony, the bitter irony that a historian might note a century later, was that every nation mobilized to defend itself. Austria-Hungary moved to crush Serbian terrorism. Russia mobilized to protect Slavic brothers. Germany mobilized to support Austria and preempt French and Russian attack. France mobilized because Germany mobilized. Britain entered to uphold Belgian neutrality and maintain the balance of power. Each nation believed it had no choice. Each nation believed it was the victim, and perhaps, in a sense, they were all victims of a system they had created, a web of alliances and mobilization timetables, and offense-minded military doctrines that left no room for diplomacy once the first shot was fired. The assassination in Sarajevo was the spark, but the fuel had been laid over years: imperial rivalries, naval arms races, colonial disputes, Balkan wars, a brittle peace maintained by the threat of war, which meant that when war came, it came completely. As July became August, as August declarations of war cascaded across Europe like falling dominoes, there was a moment when people stood in city squares and cheered. They really cheered. In Berlin and Paris, London and Vienna, St. Petersburg and Belgrade, not everyone, of course. Some saw what was coming, but they were drowned out by the crowds waving flags, by the bands playing martial music, by the young men eager to prove themselves. War had come to Europe before. The continent had survived the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, the Franco-Prussian War. Surely civilization would survive again. Surely the fighting would be brief, the casualties manageable, the outcome decisive. Surely. But this time would be different. This time, industrial civilization would turn its full power toward destruction. Railways would move millions of men to the front. Telegraph wires would coordinate armies across hundreds of miles. Factories would produce shells by the millions. Science would devise new ways to kill, from poison gas to aircraft to submarines. The world of 19th century warfare, where battles lasted days and armies moved at the speed of marching men and cavalry, was about to die. In its place would emerge something that 19th century soldiers would not recognize: trenches stretching for hundreds of miles, artillery barrages lasting weeks, casualties measured not in thousands but in hundreds of thousands. A new phrase would enter the lexicon: total war. But that August, as the summer sun shone on Europe, as couples waltzed in Vienna and young men boarded trains across the continent, that future remained mercifully hidden. They went to war with cavalry and expected to be home by Christmas. They believed in glory and honor and the righteousness of their cause. History would judge them not for their courage, which was real, but for their blindness, and perhaps that judgment is too harsh. Perhaps we, looking back with the clarity of hindsight, knowing what followed, knowing the price that would be paid, should instead feel something else: sorrow. Deep, profound sorrow for a civilization about to devour itself. The assassination of an archduke in a Balkan city most Europeans could not find on a map had started a chain reaction. Now, like some vast and terrible machine, the war engines of Europe ground into motion. Millions of men were on the move. Weapons were being distributed. Artillery was being positioned. Soon, very soon, those guns would fire, and, when they did, the old world, that world of summer days and waltzing couples, of empires that seemed eternal and progress that seemed inevitable, would begin its long and terrible death. The storm clouds had gathered. Thunder rolled across Europe. The deluge was about to begin. The German armies that crossed into Belgium on August 4th, 1914, moved like a grey tide. Picture it: columns of men stretching back to the horizon, their boots striking the cobblestones in rhythm, their spiked helmets glinting in the summer sun. They sang as they marched, Deutschland über alles, the Watch on the Rhine, songs their fathers and grandfathers had sung, songs that spoke of German greatness and destiny. They were implementing a plan that had been refined for years. The Schlieffen Plan, named for the old field marshal who had conceived it, was audacious in its scope. Wheel the bulk of the German army through Belgium, sweep around Paris like a closing door, trap the French armies against their own fortifications. 6 weeks. That was the calculation. 6 weeks to defeat France, then turn east to face Russia. It was a plan built on railway timetables and mathematical precision, and like so many plans, it began to unravel the moment it met reality. Belgium was supposed to yield. After all, what could a small nation do against the German war machine? But King Albert, that quiet monarch whom few had expected to show steel, stood firm. "Belgium is a nation, not a road," he declared. His small army, outnumbered 10-1, prepared to resist. The Belgian fortresses were formidable. Liège, guarding the approach to Brussels, boasted 12 forts with walls of reinforced concrete and steel. Military engineers had proclaimed them impregnable. The Germans brought something new: massive siege guns, including the legendary Big Bertha, weapons so enormous they had to be transported in pieces and assembled on site. When they fired, the sound could be heard 30 miles away. Each shell weighed nearly a ton. The Belgian forts, those monuments to 19th century military engineering, crumbled under bombardment that belonged to a new century. Walls that were supposed to withstand anything shattered like pottery. The defenders fought with desperate courage, but courage could not stop high explosive shells that buried men alive in the rubble of their own fortifications. As the Germans advanced, they encountered resistance from Belgian civilians. Franc-tireurs, they called them, guerrilla fighters. The German response was savage. Villages were burned. Civilians were executed. The medieval university city of Louvain, with its priceless library holding manuscripts dating back centuries, was put to the torch. 300,000 books turned to ash. The smoke rising from Louvain was visible for miles, a dark column ascending into the summer sky like an offering to some terrible god. The Germans called it military necessity. The Belgians called it barbarism. British newspapers called it proof of German atrocity, of the Huns' true nature. Propaganda and reality became impossible to separate. But the bodies were real. The burning buildings were real. And the refugees fleeing ahead of the German advance, their possessions loaded on carts, their faces etched with fear, they were terribly real. The British Expeditionary Force landed in France and moved to meet the German advance. These were professional soldiers, the finest infantry in Europe. British soldiers were trained to fire 15 rounds per minute with their Lee Enfield rifles, such rapid, accurate fire that Germans would swear they faced machine guns. At Mons, on August 23rd, they met the German First Army. The battle was brief but fierce. British soldiers, outnumbered 3-1, held their positions along a canal and punished the attacking Germans with withering rifle fire. But they could not hold. There were too many Germans, advancing in dense formations that absorbed casualties and kept coming. The British began to retreat, a fighting withdrawal that would last for 2 weeks and 200 miles. Legend arose from that retreat. Soldiers swore they saw angels hovering over the battlefield at Mons, heavenly hosts protecting the British army. Officers reported phantom bowmen appearing in the sky. The ghosts of Agincourt's archers come to aid their descendants. Whether vision or hallucination born of exhaustion and stress, the Angel of Mons entered British mythology. The retreat continued. The heat was oppressive. Men marched until they dropped from exhaustion, then were kicked awake to march again. Their boots wore through, their feet bled. Some men fell asleep while walking, stumbling forward in a trance. The German pursuit was relentless. In Paris, the government prepared to flee to Bordeaux. The Germans were coming. German cavalry patrols reached points where they could see the Eiffel Tower through their field glasses. The capital of France, that city of light and culture, seemed about to fall. Then came the miracle. General Joffre, commander of French forces, had been retreating for 2 weeks, pulling his armies back toward Paris, absorbing defeat after defeat. But he was not panicking. He was watching, waiting. The German armies were executing the Schlieffen Plan, but they were exhausted too. Their supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles, their formations had become separated, and in their haste to envelop Paris, they had turned southeast, exposing their right flank. Joffre struck. The Battle of the Marne began on September 6th. French armies that had been retreating suddenly turned and attacked. The Germans, surprised, reeled back. Paris mobilized everything it had. In one of history's most famous moments, 600 Parisian taxi drivers were commandeered to ferry 6,000 soldiers to the front. The taxis of the Marne, they would be called, a perfect symbol of modern war's strange character. For 6 days, armies numbering in the millions clashed along a front stretching 75 miles. The casualties were staggering. On a single day, September 8th, 8,000 French soldiers died. Not wounded, died. In one day. It was a preview of what was coming, though no one yet understood. The German advance, that inexorable grey tide that had swept across Belgium and France, faltered. Gaps opened between German armies. British and French forces pressed into them. The German commanders, Moltke commanding from Luxembourg, hundreds of miles from the front, lost his nerve. He ordered a retreat. The Germans fell back to the Aisne River, dug in, and stopped. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. France would not be knocked out of the war in 6 weeks. The war would not be over by Christmas. Both armies now faced a problem. They had reached stalemate in the centre, but the flanks remained open. Northern France, stretching toward the English Channel, was still contested ground. Both sides saw the same solution: outflank the enemy, get behind them, restore the war of movement. They called it the Race to the Sea. It was not really a race, it was a series of bloody clashes as each army tried to get around the other, only to find the enemy had moved to block them. Each movement northward resulted in a battle, a stalemate, and another movement farther north. The race ended at Ypres, that ancient Belgian city that would give its name to battles that would soak its surrounding fields with blood. Here, the British Expeditionary Force made its final stand. Wave after wave of German attacks crashed against British positions. The professional soldiers of the British Army, the men who had marched into Mons, died in the mud around Ypres. They held, but at terrible cost. Of the 100,000 men who had crossed the Channel in August, only a fraction remained alive and unwounded by November. The war of movement was over. From the Swiss border to the English Channel, 400 miles of the continuous front now existed, and everywhere soldiers were digging trenches. At first, they were simple scrapes in the earth, holes for men to shelter in during artillery bombardment. But as the weeks passed and both sides realized neither could advance, the trenches deepened, became more elaborate, dugouts were excavated, communication trenches connected front lines to rear areas, barbed wire sprouted in no man's land like some steel crop. The trench systems would become elaborately organized cities underground. But in those first months, they were crude, muddy, miserable places where men learned what war in the industrial age truly meant. To the east, a different drama unfolded. The Russian army, true to its alliance, had mobilized with impressive speed and invaded East Prussia. 2 armies, each numbering hundreds of thousands, pushed into German territory while German attention was focused on France. In St. Petersburg, there was talk of marching on Berlin. The Germans sent 2 generals to save East Prussia. Paul von Hindenburg, 67 years old, called out of retirement. Erich Ludendorff, younger, brilliant, ruthless. They found a situation that looked desperate and saw opportunity. The two Russian armies were separated by lakes and marshes. They could not support each other. Their commanders disliked each other, and critically, catastrophically, they communicated by radio using codes the Germans had broken. The Germans could read Russian plans as they were being made. At Tannenberg, named for a medieval battle site, Hindenburg and Ludendorff sprung their trap. They concentrated against one Russian army while holding off the other. German artillery shattered Russian formations. German infantry enveloped Russian positions. The Russian Second Army was destroyed, not defeated, destroyed. 92,000 men captured, 50,000 casualties. The army commander, General Samsonov, wandered into the forest and shot himself. At the Masurian Lakes, the process repeated. The Russian First Army barely escaped annihilation, fleeing back across the border in disorder. The Russian invasion of Germany was over, but Russia's vast spaces absorbed defeat. More armies formed. The Eastern Front stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, a distance greater than the entire Western Front, with far fewer troops to hold it. Here, unlike the West, war remained mobile. Vast movements, great encirclements, hundreds of thousands captured in single battles, but also vast distances that absorbed advancing armies and made final victory impossible. The Austro-Hungarian army invaded Serbia, certain of quick victory. They were repulsed. They invaded again. Again they were thrown back. The Serbian army, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with fierce determination. They were defending their homeland. The Austrians were fighting for an empire many of them did not quite believe in. By December, Austrian armies had been driven from Serbian soil, humiliated by a nation they had expected to crush in weeks. At sea, the great battleship fleets watched each other warily. Britain's Royal Navy was the world's largest. Germany's fleet, the product of decades of massive investment. But neither side was willing to risk everything in a decisive battle. The German High Seas Fleet mostly stayed in port. British battleships maintained their distant blockade, choking Germany's access to the world's resources. It was a slow strangulation, not the glorious naval battle both sides had expected. German submarines, U-boats, began to hunt British shipping. A new form of warfare was emerging, one that would bring Britain to the edge of starvation before the war ended. By November, as the first winter of the war approached, the pattern was set. In the west, stalemate and trenches. In the east, mobile warfare across vast distances. At sea, blockade and submarine war. And everywhere, casualties that shocked even hardened generals. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas was just beginning. The soldiers settling into their trenches, wrapping scarves against the cold, writing letters home by candlelight, did not yet know they would be there for years, did not yet know that many of them would never leave. The guns of August had thundered across Europe. Their echo would last 4 years and reshape the world. The old certainties were dying. Cavalry charges ended in machine gun fire. Fortresses crumbled under super-heavy artillery. Professional armies bled to death against barbed wire and trenches. The Great War, as it would be called, was teaching terrible lessons. And the most terrible lesson of all, that modern industrial civilization, turned toward war, could produce death on a scale previously unimaginable. The battles of August through November had cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The wounded filled every hospital. The dead filled cemeteries that grew and grew. This was supposed to be a war of glory, of honor, of decisive battles and dramatic victories. Instead, it was becoming something else. A grinding, attritional struggle where victory would go not to the most courageous or most skilled, but to whichever side could endure longest. The storm had broken. The deluge had begun, and there was no end in sight. Imagine descending into the earth, not the clean earth of a garden or field, but mud that clutches at your boots like something alive. Water seeps through sandbags. The smell is overwhelming, a mixture of unwashed bodies, latrine buckets, rotting food, and something else, something sweet and terrible that you learn not to think about. This is the trench. This is home. From the Swiss border to the English Channel, 400 miles of parallel lines scarred the landscape. But to call them lines suggests something simple, temporary. By the winter of 1914 and 15, the trenches had become something far more complex. They were cities carved into the earth, elaborate networks of passages and chambers where millions of men would spend the next 4 years of their lives. The front-line trench faced the enemy, sometimes separated by mere yards of no man's land, sometimes by distances you could not sprint across before machine gun fire cut you down. Behind it ran support trenches, then reserve trenches, all connected by communication trenches that zigzagged to prevent enemy fire from enfilading straight down their length. The trenches never ran straight. They curved, turned at angles, created traverses that would contain the blast when a shell found its mark. Beneath the trenches, men dug deeper, dugouts to shelter from bombardment. Some were simple holes covered with timber and sandbags. Others, particularly on the German side, became elaborate underground chambers 20 or 30 feet down, complete with electric lights, bunks, even wallpaper. The Germans, having decided they would hold what they had taken, built their trenches as permanent fortifications. The British and French, insisting they would soon advance, built theirs more haphazardly. It was a difference that cost lives every time artillery fired. Life in the trenches followed a rhythm as regular as the tides. Stand to at dawn, when attacks were most likely. Every man at his post, rifle loaded, bayonet fixed, peering into the growing light to see if the enemy was coming. Then, as the sun rose and no attack materialized, stand down. Breakfast. Usually tinned food, bully beef or sardines, hard biscuits, tea if you were lucky. The British Army ran on tea. In the worst moments of bombardment, when the world seemed to be ending, men would brew tea. Then came the work. Endless. Back-breaking work. Trenches required constant maintenance. Walls collapsed. Duckboards rotted. Sandbags split and spilled their contents. Drainage ditches filled with mud. Wire needed repair. If you were not on sentry duty or working party, you might snatch a few hours of sleep, curled up in a dugout with rats running across. Your face. The rats were everywhere. Great bloated creatures that fed on the unburied dead in no man's land, on discarded food, on anything organic. They were fearless, these rats. They would steal food from sleeping men, bite those who disturbed them. Soldiers waged constant war against them, but the rats always won. For every one killed, 10 more appeared. And the lice. Within days of arriving at the front, every man was infested. The lice lived in the seams of uniforms, bred in body heat, bit constantly. Men would run candle flames along their seams, hearing the lice pop in the heat, but it was futile. The lice always returned. Soldiers called it reading the paper, this daily ritual of hunting lice in their clothing. Night brought different routines. Patrols into no man's land, crawling through mud and wire to gather intelligence, to capture prisoners, to repair wire or dig saps closer to enemy lines. This was when men died quietly. A sudden burst of machine gun fire, a grenade, and someone who had been beside you was gone. In the darkness, with flares casting strange shadows, no man's land became a nightmare landscape where nothing was certain. Yet humans are adaptable creatures, remarkably, impossibly adaptable. The soldiers of the Great War created culture in this underworld. They published newspapers, elaborate trench journals with names like the Wipers Times, filled with dark humour, poetry, and satire. They staged theatrical performances in rest areas just behind the lines, men dressing as women for the female roles, the audience roaring with laughter at jokes that would make no sense to anyone who had not lived in the trenches. They carved art from the detritus of war. Shell casings became vases, engraved with elaborate designs. Bullets were fashioned into rings and letter openers. Shrapnel was worked into bracelets. This trench art represented something profound, the human need to create beauty, even in the midst of destruction, to assert that we are more than the violence surrounding us. They developed superstitions and rituals, lucky charms that must be touched before going over the top. Certain spots in the trench that were considered safe or dangerous, based on nothing but collective belief. Soldiers would refuse to use a particular fire step because someone had died there. They carried talismans, photographs of loved ones, St. Christopher medals, Bibles, anything that might preserve life in a place where death was random and constant. And then came Christmas, December 1914. The war was 4 months old. Already hundreds of thousands were dead. The trenches were miserable in winter, flooded, freezing, men huddling for warmth. But as Christmas approached, something remarkable happened. On Christmas Eve, German soldiers began placing candles on their trench parapets, small lights glowing in the darkness. Then they began to sing, Stille Nacht, Silent Night. The melody drifted across no man's land that scarred earth between the trenches where nothing lived. In the British trenches, men listened. Then they began to sing in reply. Carols in English. The French joined in, songs drifting back and forth across the lines, across the war itself. On Christmas morning, in sectors all along the front, men climbed out of their trenches, climbed into no man's land, walked toward the enemy with hands raised, showing they were unarmed. And the Germans climbed out to meet them. They shook hands, these men who yesterday had been trying to kill each other. They exchanged gifts. Cigarettes, chocolate, bottles of schnapps or rum. They showed each other photographs of families, wives, children. They were mostly young men, these soldiers, farm boys and clerks, students and labourers, in different uniforms, speaking different languages, but not so different from each other. They buried the dead who had lain in no man's land, giving them proper graves, saying prayers over bodies that had been part of the landscape of war. British and German chaplains stood side by side conducting services, and they played football, improvised balls made from sandbags, goals marked by piles of equipment. The game was chaotic, joyful, absurd. Enemies kicking a ball around in the mud while their officers watched in horror, knowing that this fraternization undermined everything the war was supposed to mean. The Christmas truce, it would be called. It did not happen everywhere. In some sectors the fighting continued, but in many places along the line, enemies became, for a few hours, just men. Men who wanted the same things: to survive, to go home, to live in peace. The High Command was appalled. Orders went out forbidding fraternization. Officers who allowed it were disciplined. The next Christmas, artillery bombardments were scheduled to prevent any repetition. The Christmas truce of 1914 would never be repeated, not on that scale. But it happened. It really happened, and it revealed something profound about the war's essential absurdity. These men did not hate each other. They had no personal quarrel. They had been sent to kill each other by governments and generals pursuing aims most of them did not understand. The Christmas truce was a brief moment when humanity reasserted itself, when ordinary soldiers declared, if only for a day, that they were something more than instruments of war. But the war continued. It had to continue. Too much had been invested. Too many had died. Too much pride was at stake. The war had developed its own momentum, its own logic, independent of the men fighting it. In 1915, the generals sought the breakthrough. Surely there must be some way to crack the trench systems, to restore mobile warfare, to win. They tried artillery bombardments of unprecedented scale. They tried massing troops for overwhelming attacks. They tried striking at different points along the line. Nothing worked. The defensive power of machine guns and barbed wire, of trenches and artillery, was simply too great. Attackers advanced into storms of steel and died in windows. Occasionally they captured enemy trenches, only to be driven out by counterattacks or find themselves in exposed positions hammered by artillery. Then, on April 22, 1915, the war changed again. At Ypres, that unfortunate city whose name British soldiers could never quite pronounce, they called it Wipers. German soldiers opened canisters along a 4-mile front. A greenish-yellow cloud drifted across the battlefield, carried by the wind toward French colonial and Canadian positions. Chlorine gas. Heavier than air, it rolled along the ground and sank into the trenches. Men who breathed it felt their lungs burning, their throats closing, their eyes weeping uncontrollably. They fled in panic, coughing, choking, dying. The gas created a gap in the Allied line 4 miles wide. The Germans advanced through the gap, but, not fully trusting their new weapon, had insufficient reserves to exploit the breakthrough. The line was restored, but gas warfare had arrived. Soon both sides were using it. Chlorine, then phosgene, then mustard gas that burned skin and lungs, that lingered in shell holes and dugouts for days. Gas masks became standard equipment, but they were imperfect protection. Gas killed, but more often it disabled, sending men to hospitals where they would cough up pieces of their lungs, where they would die, slowly, drowning in their own fluids. Gas attacks were terrifying in ways that bullets and shells were not. You could not see gas coming, not always. It was insidious, creeping, inhuman. It represented the war's progression toward total, industrial killing, where chemistry and industry combined to create new forms of death. Yet even as gas warfare spread, something else was happening above the trenches. A new battlefield was emerging in the sky. Aircraft had been novelties at the war's start, flimsy contraptions of wood and fabric used for reconnaissance. Pilots from opposing sides would wave to each other as they passed, gentlemen observing the quaint conventions of the air. Then they began carrying pistols, taking potshots at each other. Then machine guns. Then the arms race escalated. Fighter aircraft emerged. The Fokker Eindecker, with its synchronized machine gun that fired through the propeller arc. The British Bristol Scout. The French Nieuport. Young men who would never have met on the ground dueled thousands of feet in the air, their fragile machines twisting and diving, machine guns chattering. When a plane caught fire and they burned easily, these wood and fabric constructions soaked in flammable dope the pilot usually burned with it. Parachutes were considered ungentlemanly, a temptation for pilots to abandon their expensive aircraft too readily. The fighter aces became heroes. Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, painted his plane bright red and led a squadron called the Flying Circus. Georges Guynemer, the French ace, frail and consumptive on the ground, a deadly predator in the air. Billy Bishop, the Canadian ace who hunted alone. Albert Ball, the British ace who would fly into clouds of enemy aircraft and emerge victorious. These men were the war's last romantic heroes, knights of the air, engaging in single combat high above the mud and horror of the trenches. When they died, and most did, the life expectancy of a fighter pilot measured in weeks they were mourned even by their enemies. Richthofen, when he was finally shot down in 1918, was buried by the Australians with full military honours. But the romance was an illusion. Air combat was as brutal as any other form of warfare. Planes crashed. Men burned. The technology was primitive and unreliable. Many pilots died in accidents, their engines failing, their wings collapsing, their controls jamming. And the reconnaissance aircraft, the lumbering bombers, had no romance at all. They were simply targets, slow and vulnerable, their crews hoping desperately to survive one more mission. Back on the ground, in the trenches, men watched the aerial combats with fascination. It was entertainment, a distraction from the daily grind of mud and fear. When a plane fell, trailing smoke, men would cheer if it was the enemy, fall silent if it was their own. The war in the air seemed cleaner, more noble than the war in the mud. But it was all part of the same war. The same industrial civilization that produced machine guns and poison gas also produced aircraft. The same nation-states that sent millions into trenches also sent young men into the sky to kill and die. The technology changed. The location changed. The fundamental nature of the war did not. As 1915 ended and 1916 began, the trenches remained. The war had settled into a stalemate that neither side knew how to break. Offensives were launched. Thousands died. A few miles of muddy ground changed hands, and then the lines stabilized again. The soldiers who survived learned to live with the constant proximity of death. They learned which sounds meant danger and which were routine. They learned to sleep through artillery fire, to eat while rats scurried nearby, to write cheerful letters home while sitting in mud and filth. They learned to mourn their friends quickly and move on, because if you mourned everyone, you would go mad. They learned that war was not glory but simply a job, a terrible job that had to be done. They learned that courage was not the absence of fear but the ability to function despite fear. They learned that they were capable of more than they had ever imagined, both of endurance and of violence. The trenches were a school, and the curriculum was survival. Most would graduate, many would not. But all of them, whether they lived or died, were changed by the experience. The world they had known, the certainties they had believed, were gone. In their place was something harder, darker, but also in some strange way more honest. They had descended into the earth and discovered what humanity truly was when stripped of civilization's veneer. What they found there, in the mud and blood and darkness, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The descent was complete. Now came the long, terrible years of endurance. There is a place in France where nothing grows. Even now, a century later, the earth remains poisoned. The forests that once covered these hills are gone. In their place, craters, thousands upon thousands of overlapping craters, creating a landscape that resembles the surface of the moon more than anything on Earth. And what happened here in 1916 defines the horror of industrial warfare. The German Crown Prince Wilhelm, eager to prove himself, proposed a battle of pure attrition. The idea was chillingly simple. Attack a position the French must defend at all costs, force them to feed troops into a killing ground, bleed France white, Operation Gericht, Operation Judgment. The target was the fortress complex around Verdun, ancient stronghold on the Meuse River. The Germans assembled 1,200 artillery pieces, more firepower concentrated in one place than had ever been gathered in human history. On February 21st at 7:15 in the morning, they opened fire. Imagine, if you can, what it meant. Not dozens of guns firing, not hundreds, over 1,000 heavy artillery pieces, all firing simultaneously at French positions less than 10 miles wide. The sound was heard 100 miles away. The earth shook. Trees were uprooted and flung into the air. Trenches simply disappeared, buried under tons of earth. Men went mad from the noise alone, the constant, unending thunder that seemed to signal the end of the world. The bombardment lasted 9 hours. 1 million shells fell on the French positions. When the German infantry advanced, they expected to find nothing alive. They were wrong. Frenchmen emerged from the rubble, from deep dugouts that had somehow survived, and fought with desperate courage. But they could not hold. Village after village fell. Fort Douaumont, the strongest fortress in the complex, was captured by a small German patrol who found it virtually undefended. In Paris, there was panic. Verdun must not fall, could not fall. General Philippe Pétain was given command with orders to hold at all costs. He made a promise that would become a legend. They shall not pass. Ils ne passeront pas. Pétain organized a lifeline. The main road into Verdun, the Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way, became the artery keeping the defense alive. Trucks moved up the road in an endless convoy, one every 14 seconds, bringing supplies and fresh troops. Going the other direction came the wounded, the exhausted, the shell-shocked. 3/4 of the French army would rotate through Verdun during the battle. Every French soldier would experience the hell of Verdun. The battle evolved into something beyond normal warfare. It was not about capturing territory or achieving military objectives. It had become about death itself, about which side could endure more suffering. The Germans called it Blutmühle, the blood mill, an accurate description. Men were fed into Verdun and ground to pieces. Fort Douaumont changed hands 16 times. Men fought in underground tunnels with grenades and flamethrowers. They fought in darkness, lit only by muzzle flashes. They fought over ground so churned by artillery that it was impossible to tell where trenches had once been. Bodies disappeared into the mud, buried by explosions, only to be unearthed by the next shell and buried again. The wounded often could not be evacuated. They lay in shell holes for days, crying for water, for help, for death. Some drowned in the mud. Some were buried alive when shells landed nearby. Some simply disappeared, literally vaporized by direct hits from heavy shells. The battle lasted 10 months. When it finally ended in December, the front line was roughly where it had started. A few villages had changed hands. The landscape was destroyed, and the casualties were staggering. Over 700,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, nearly equal losses on both sides, for nothing. For a few miles of devastated earth that would remain uninhabitable for generations. But while the Germans were bleeding France at Verdun, the British were planning their own offensive. Along the Somme River, General Douglas Haig assembled the largest British army ever sent into battle. This would be the big push, the breakthrough that would win the war. Kitchener's volunteers, the men who had rushed to enlist in 1914, were finally ready for battle. The bombardment began on June 24, 1916. For 7 days and nights, British artillery pounded German positions. 1.5 million shells. The thunder could be heard in London, 130 miles away. British generals were confident. Nothing could survive such bombardment. The German trenches, the wire, the machine gun nests, all would be obliterated. The infantry would simply walk across no man's land and occupy the ruins. July 1st, 1916, dawned bright and clear. At 7:30 in the morning, whistles blew along the British line. Officers climbed out of the trenches and began walking toward the German lines. Behind them came waves of infantry, shoulder to shoulder, advancing at a steady walk as they had been trained. The German machine guns opened fire. The soldiers had been told the wire would be cut. It was not cut. They had been told the German dugouts would be destroyed. They were not destroyed. The Germans had built shelters 30 feet underground. They had survived the bombardment and now emerged, bringing their machine guns up from the depths. The British soldiers walked into a storm of steel. Men fell in rows, mown down like wheat before a scythe. Some units lost 80% of their strength before reaching the German wire. Entire battalions ceased to exist as fighting formations. PALS battalions, recruited from single towns or factories, died together. In some British towns, every young man of military age died on the same day. By nightfall on July 1st, the British Army had suffered 60,000 casualties, 20,000 dead, the bloodiest day in British military history, and they had gained In most sectors, nothing. But the battle continued. Through July, through August, through September and October into November. The definition of madness, surely, to repeat the same tactics expecting different results. But Haig kept attacking. The casualties mounted. The gains remained minimal. In September, the British deployed a new weapon, tanks, lumbering metal beasts that crawled across no man's land on caterpillar tracks, immune to machine gun fire. There were only 49 of them in the first attack, and most broke down before reaching German lines. But those that did reach the trenches terrified the German soldiers. Here was something new, something that seemed invincible. The tank would eventually help break the stalemate, but not yet. The technology was too primitive, the numbers too few. Most tanks broke down, got stuck in mud, or were destroyed by artillery. But they represented something important, the application of industrial technology to the problem of trench warfare. The Battle of the Somme finally ended in November, as winter mud made further operations impossible. The British and French had advanced approximately 6 miles on a 16-mile front. The casualties were catastrophic. Over 1 million men killed or wounded on both sides. Britain lost 400,000 men. Germany lost similar numbers. France, already bleeding from Verdun. What had been gained? A few miles of mud, village ruins, destroyed farmland, nothing of strategic value. The war would continue, the trenches would remain. But the Somme achieved something the generals had not intended. It destroyed the faith of ordinary soldiers in the wisdom of their commanders. The men who survived July 1st, who had walked into machine gun fire because officers ordered them to, who had watched their friends die for nothing. These men no longer believed in glory or honor. They believed in survival. They believed in their mates. They no longer believed the generals knew what they were doing. The disillusionment would spread. In 1917, it would lead to mutinies. But before that, there was one more great slaughter, Passchendaele, the Third Battle of Ypres. Haig, convinced that Germany was close to collapse, planned another offensive. The objective was to break through the German lines and capture the Belgian ports where U-boats were based, a sensible strategic goal. The execution was madness. The offensive began on July 31st, 1917, in the midst of the wettest summer in Belgian memory. The preliminary bombardment, lasting 2 weeks, destroyed the drainage systems that kept the low-lying Flanders plain from flooding. When the infantry attacked, they advanced into a swamp. Men drowned in the mud, not figuratively, literally drowned, fell into shell holes filled with water and could not climb out. Weighted down by equipment, exhausted, they simply slipped beneath the surface and died. Others, wounded, sank into the mud and disappeared. Their bodies are still there, occasionally unearthed when construction disturbs the ground. Mules and horses drowned too, sometimes with entire gun carriages. The few roads became rivers of mud. Tanks sank axle deep and could not move. Wounded men who could not be evacuated had to be left in shell holes, sometimes for days, waiting for stretcher bearers who might never come. The battle continued for 3 months, through August, through September, through October. Gains were measured in yards. Villages changed hands, repeatedly, though villages was too generous a term. They were rubble, scattered brick dust, nothing more. The fighting reached its climax at a village called Passchendaele, a name that would become synonymous with futility and horror. When the battle finally ended in November, the British had advanced 5 miles. The casualties exceeded 500,000. The U-boat bases had not been captured, the breakthrough had not occurred, and winter was coming again. Meanwhile, the war was spreading. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire faced multiple threats. the British invaded Mesopotamia, advancing toward Baghdad. At first, the campaign went well. Then, disaster. A British force was besieged at Kut, surrounded by Turkish troops, starved for 5 months, and forced to surrender. 13,000 British and Indian soldiers went into captivity. Many would not survive. But the British persisted. A new offensive, better planned and supplied, captured Baghdad in March 1917. The British flag flew over the city that had once been the center of the Abbasid Caliphate. In Palestine, British forces pushed north from Egypt toward Jerusalem. Leading them, in the most romantic campaign of the war, was T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. Dressed in Arab robes, leading Bedouin tribesmen, he waged guerrilla war against Turkish railways and supply lines. He blew up trains with explosives. He led raids across the desert on racing camels. He dreamed of Arab independence and believed Britain would honor its promises. Lawrence was a complex figure. Scholar, archaeologist, warrior, writer. He understood the Arabs he fought alongside. He spoke their language, respected their culture. But he also knew that Britain and France had secret agreements to divide the Middle East between them after the war. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, drawn up in London and Paris, carved the region into spheres of influence with no regard for the people who lived there. The contradiction tormented Lawrence. He was helping Arabs fight for independence while knowing his own government planned to deny them that independence. It was a betrayal, and he knew it. After the war, he would write a masterpiece, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, that was both adventure story and confession of guilt. In December 1917, British forces captured Jerusalem. General Allenby entered the city on foot, a gesture of respect. It was a moment of triumph in a war that had few such moments. But it was a triumph built on promises that would not be kept, on lines drawn on maps that would haunt the Middle East for a century. Far to the east, another drama was unfolding. The Czech Legion, 40,000 soldiers who had been fighting for Russia against Austria-Hungary, now found themselves stranded as Russia collapsed into civil war. They wanted to reach France and continue fighting. The only route was east, across Siberia, then by ship across the Pacific. The Czech Legion began one of the most extraordinary journeys in military history. They commandeered trains and fought their way along the Trans-Siberian Railway, battling Bolsheviks, dealing with local warlords, protecting themselves in the chaos of the Russian Civil War. For months, they controlled the entire railway, a lifeline across 6,000 miles of frozen wilderness. Some Czechs married Russian women and stayed. Some died in forgotten skirmishes in Siberian forests. But many reached Vladivostok, sailed for America, crossed the Pacific and Atlantic, and finally arrived in France to fight for their dream of an independent Czechoslovakia. And in Turkey, hidden from the world, occurred one of the war's darkest chapters, the Armenian genocide. The Ottoman government, led by the Young Turks, viewed Armenians as a potential fifth column, sympathetic to Russia and dangerous to Turkish security. In April 1915, the systematic destruction began. Armenian intellectuals and community leaders were arrested and executed. Then came the deportations. Armenians were forced to march into the Syrian desert without food, water, or protection. Women were raped. Children were stolen and forcibly converted to Islam. Entire caravans were massacred by Turkish troops or Kurdish irregulars. 1.5 million Armenians died. It was the 20th century's first genocide, a preview of horrors to come. The world paid little attention. There was a war on, after all. A few diplomats and missionaries protested. Some tried to save lives, but the great powers were busy killing each other and had little time for the suffering of a small Christian minority in the Ottoman Empire. The genocide would be denied for decades, still is denied by Turkish governments today, but the survivors remembered. They carried the memories to new homes in America, France, Lebanon, Armenia itself, when it finally gained independence. The Armenian diaspora became a testament to survival, but also a reminder of how easily the world can ignore atrocity when it is convenient to do so. By the end of 1917, the war had consumed 3 years. Millions were dead, empires were crumbling, and still there was no end in sight. The industrial killing machine had reached its full, terrible expression. At Verdun, at the Somme, at Passchendaele, generals had learned that they could feed men into battles by the hundreds of thousands. The casualties no longer shocked. They had become statistics, numbers in reports, names carved on memorials. The soldiers endured because humans can endure almost anything when there is no choice. They wrote letters home describing the weather, the food, the small comforts, never mentioning the horror. They did not want their loved ones to know. They did not want to remember themselves. Between battles they played cards, wrote in journals, carved more trench art, and they waited. Waited for the war to end. Waited to go home. Waited to see if they would survive the next offensive, the next bombardment, the next random shell with their name on it. The slaughter continued. Industrial scale, mechanical, efficient, terrible, and the world was changed forever. In Petrograd, in the winter of 1917, women stood in bread lines that stretched for blocks. They had been standing in those lines for hours in the bitter cold, waiting for bread that might not come. Russia was starving. Not because there was no food, but because the railways that should have brought food to the cities were instead carrying men and munitions to the front. The war had broken Russia. 3 years of catastrophic losses, of offensives that collapsed, of soldiers sent to fight without rifles, expected to pick up weapons from their dead comrades. 3 years of a Tsar who could not lead, and a Tsarina who listened to a mad monk named Rasputin. 3 years of suffering while the aristocracy seemed oblivious, dancing in grand ballrooms while the people starved. On March 8th, 1917, International Women's Day, the women in the breadlines began to protest. They were joined by factory workers. The demonstrations grew. Soldiers sent to disperse them instead joined them. Within days, the unthinkable happened. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 300 years, simply collapsed. Tsar Nicholas II was at the front when revolution exploded in Petrograd. He tried to return to the capital, but his train was stopped. In a railway car at Pskov station, surrounded by generals who had lost faith in him, he signed the abdication document. The Tsar of all the Russias, descendant of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, gave up his throne in a railway car. A provisional government took power, promising democracy, promising to continue the war. Alexander Kerensky, a passionate socialist lawyer, became its leader. He believed Russia could be democratic and victorious. He was wrong on both counts. Vladimir Lenin saw his opportunity. He had been in exile in Switzerland, waiting for the revolution he had always believed would come. The Germans, calculating that his return to Russia would undermine the Russian war effort, provided a sealed train to carry Lenin across Germany to Finland. It was one of history's most consequential train journeys. Lenin arrived at Finland Station in Petrograd in April, and immediately began working to overthrow the provisional government. His slogans were simple and powerful. Peace, land, bread. End the war. Give land to the peasants. Feed the people. The provisional government offered none of these things. Lenin promised all of them. Meanwhile, Kerensky launched one last offensive. In July 1917, Russian armies attacked in Galicia. Initially, they achieved surprise and captured ground. Then the Germans counterattacked. The Russian army disintegrated. Not retreated, disintegrated. Soldiers threw away their rifles and walked home. Officers who tried to restore order were shot by their own men. The Russian army as a fighting force ceased to exist. In November, the Bolsheviks struck. The October Revolution, they called it October because Russia still used the old Julian calendar, was almost bloodless. Red Guards seized key points in Petrograd. The Winter Palace, where the provisional government met, was stormed. The ministers were arrested. Lenin announced that the Soviet government was now in power. One of Lenin's first acts was to seek peace with Germany. Russia, he declared, was leaving the war. At Brest-Litovsk, in German-occupied Poland, Soviet and German delegations met to negotiate. The Germans presented terms that were essentially dictation. Russia would lose Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, vast territories containing a third of Russia's population and much of its industry. Leon Trotsky, leading the Soviet delegation, tried to resist. He proposed no war, no peace. Russia would simply stop fighting but sign no treaty. The Germans responded by resuming their advance, driving deeper into Russia. Lenin overruled Trotsky. "Sign the treaty," he ordered. "We need peace to consolidate the revolution. Everything else can wait." The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed in March 1918. It was a humiliating peace, stripping Russia of territories it had held for centuries. But Lenin got what he wanted. Time. Time to establish Soviet power. Time to fight the civil war that was already beginning between Reds and Whites. The Whites' anti-Bolshevik forces, ranging from monarchists to moderate socialists, would fight for 3 more years. Foreign powers, including Britain, France, Japan, and the United States, would send troops to support them. But that is another story. For now, Russia was out of the Great War. Germany had won in the East. 50 divisions could now be transferred west for one final attempt to win before American strength became overwhelming. But Germany had also revealed something troubling. Faced with the choice between a moderate peace and a dictated peace, Germany had chosen to be harsh, to demand vast territories, to impose punitive terms. It was a preview of what Germany would do if it won in the West. While Russia collapsed, Austria-Hungary was fragmenting from within. The Habsburg Empire was a multinational state. Germans and Hungarians, Czechs and Slovaks, Poles and Ruthenians, Croats and Serbs and Slovenes, Romanians and Italians. It held together through loyalty to the ancient dynasty and the person of the emperor. But that glue was dissolving. Czech and Slovak politicians in exile formed a national council demanding independence. South Slavs, Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes within the empire began organizing for their own state. The Poles dreamed of a resurrected Poland. Emperor Karl, who had succeeded Franz Joseph in 1916, tried desperately to hold the empire together. He made secret peace overtures to the Allies, offering to break with Germany, to grant autonomy to the nationalities. But it was too late. On the Italian front, the war had been particularly brutal and pointless. Italy had entered the war in 1915 on the Allied side, tempted by promises of Austrian territory. The fighting settled into stalemate along the Isonzo River, where 11 battles were fought over 2 years with minimal gains and catastrophic casualties. Then came Caporetto. In October 1917, German and Austrian forces launched an offensive using new infiltration tactics. Stormtroopers, lightly armed and trained to bypass strong points, penetrated deep into Italian lines. Poison gas added to the chaos. The Italian Second Army collapsed. 300,000 Italian soldiers were captured. Another 300,000 deserted or simply fled. It was one of the greatest military routs in history. The Austro-German forces advanced 70 miles in weeks. Venice seemed threatened. The Italian government nearly fell. But the line stabilized at the Piave River. Italian soldiers, fighting now to defend their homeland rather than conquer Austrian territory, held firm. German divisions were recalled to the Western Front. The crisis passed. But Caporetto revealed how brittle all the armies had become after 3 years of war. And in France, the unthinkable happened. The French army mutinied. In April 1917, General Robert Nivelle had launched an offensive he promised would win the war in 48 hours. The Nivelle offensive was based on new tactics, massive artillery support, and supreme confidence. It failed spectacularly. The Germans had learned of the plans through captured documents. They pulled back to prepared positions, the Hindenburg Line, and let the French exhaust themselves attacking empty trenches. When the French finally reached German positions, they were slaughtered. 120,000 French casualties in the first week. For gains measured in hundreds of yards, it was the Somme all over again. But worse because Nivelle had promised so much. The French soldiers had endured Verdun. They had endured 3 years of war. They had accepted terrible losses when they believed in their commanders. But Nivelle had promised an end to the slaughter and delivered only more slaughter. They had had enough. In May, soldiers began refusing to attack. Not refusing to defend, they still held their trenches. But they would not participate in more futile offensives. Units marched to the front singing revolutionary songs. They elected committees. They demanded peace, or at minimum an end to the meat grinder tactics. It was not cowardice. It was a rational response to irrational leadership. The mutinies spread to 54 divisions. The French army was on the brink of collapse. If the Germans had known, if they had attacked, the war might have ended right there. But the French High Command kept the mutinies secret, and they replaced Nivelle with Philippe Pétain, the defender of Verdun, the general soldiers trusted. Pétain acted with surprising wisdom. He improved conditions, better food, more regular leave, rest areas farther from the front. He listened to the soldiers' complaints, he addressed their grievances, and he restored discipline, but with restraint. Courts-martial sentenced hundreds to death, but only 23 were actually executed. Pétain understood that the soldiers were not the enemy. Bad leadership was the enemy. By summer, the mutinies had ended. The French army was intact but changed. There would be no more grand offensives, not until American forces arrived in strength. The war in the West would be defensive, attritional, waiting for American power to tip the balance. Across the Atlantic, America was mobilizing. The United States had entered the war in April 1917 after Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, and after the Zimmermann telegram revealed German plans to offer Mexico an alliance against America. President Woodrow Wilson, who had kept America neutral for nearly 3 years, now declared that the world must be made safe for democracy. The American army numbered only 100,000 men when war was declared. Within 18 months, it would grow to 4 million. Young men registered for the draft, trained at newly built camps, and shipped across the Atlantic in troop ships that sailed despite the U-boat threat. By summer 1918, 250,000 Americans were arriving in France every month. The Doughboys, as they were called, brought fresh energy to a war-weary Europe. They were idealistic, confident, naive. European soldiers, hardened by years of trench warfare, looked at them with a mixture of affection and concern. These Americans did not understand what they were getting into. They would learn, as everyone had learned, but the learning would cost lives. General John J. Pershing, commanding the American Expeditionary Force, insisted that American troops fight as an independent army under American command. The British and French wanted to use American soldiers as replacements in their depleted divisions. Pershing refused. It was a matter of national pride, but also of military judgment. He believed American tactics and spirit required American leadership. The first major American battle came in May 1918 at Cantigny. It was a small operation by Western Front standards, but it mattered. The Americans attacked, captured their objectives, and held against counterattacks. They had proven they could fight. More battles would follow. Belleau Wood, where Marines earned immortal glory fighting in a forest. Château Thierry, where Americans helped stop a German offensive. Saint-Mihiel, where Pershing launched his first large-scale attack. But that lay ahead. For now, in early 1918, the Americans were still arriving, still training, still learning. The question was whether they would arrive in time, because Germany was preparing one last titanic gamble. With Russia defeated and 50 divisions freed from the Eastern Front, Germany would launch a series of massive offensives in the West. The goal was to split the British and French armies, drive to the Channel, win the war before American strength became overwhelming. It was a race against time, and everything depended on the outcome. Meanwhile, at sea, Britain was being slowly strangled. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. In April 1917 alone, U-boats sank nearly 900,000 tons of shipping. Britain had only 6 weeks of grain reserves remaining. The island nation that ruled a global empire was on the verge of starvation. The solution was the convoy system. Merchant ships would travel in groups, protected by destroyers and other warships. It seemed obvious in retrospect, but the Royal Navy had resisted convoys, arguing they would slow commerce and make ships easier to find. They were wrong. Convoys dramatically reduced losses. By late 1917, the U-boat threat was contained, though never eliminated. The great surface fleets, meanwhile, remained in port. After the Battle of Jutland in 1916, an inconclusive slugging match where both sides claimed victory, neither the British Grand Fleet nor the German High Seas Fleet was willing to risk a decisive battle. The British maintained their distant blockade. The German fleet stayed in harbour. It was a stalemate at sea to match the stalemate on land. The blockade, however, was slowly killing Germany. Food was scarce. The winter of 1916-17 was called the Turnip Winter, because turnips were often the only food available. Civilians were starving. Children suffered from malnutrition. Rationing was severe, but rations were often not available. The black market flourished. Resentment grew. Germany was winning militarily in the east and holding in the west, but it was losing the war of endurance Britain could draw on. Global resources, food from Canada and Argentina, raw materials from the Empire, eventually the industrial might of America. Germany had only what it could produce itself, or extract from conquered territories. It was not enough. The German High Command knew this. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who effectively ran Germany by 1918, understood that time was the enemy. They had to win quickly, or not at all. The spring offensive of 1918 would be Germany's last chance. But first, a winter to endure. Soldiers on both sides huddled in frozen trenches, wrapped in whatever clothing they could find, dreaming of home. The war had been going on for 3.5 years. Millions were dead. Empires had fallen. The world had been transformed. And still, the war continued. Because once such a war begins, once so much has been invested, and so many have died, stopping becomes almost impossible. National pride will not allow it. Strategic calculation will not allow it. The demands of the dead will not allow it. The war must be won, whatever the cost. So the armies waited through the winter, preparing for the spring. The Germans prepared their offensive, the Allies prepared their defences, and everyone waited to see which side would break first. The empires of the old world were crumbling. Russia had fallen to revolution. Austria-Hungary was fragmentating. The Ottoman Empire was being dismembered. Even Germany, still fighting, still powerful, was being hollowed out from within by starvation and exhaustion. A new world was being born in the ruins of the old. What shape it would take, no one yet knew. But it would not be the world of 1914, of empires and emperors, of certainties and hierarchies that had seemed eternal. That world was dying. Its death throes were terrible. And the birth of the new world would be no less painful. The eagles were falling, the crowns were crumbling, and still the guns fired on. At 4:40 in the morning, on March 21st, 1918, the world exploded. 6,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along a 50-mile front. It was the heaviest bombardment in human history. High explosive shells mixed with gas shells, phosgene, mustard gas, tear gas. The British positions simply disappeared under a steel storm. Trenches collapsed. Communication lines were cut. Command posts were buried. Men who had survived 3 years of war were vaporized in an instant. This was Operation Michael, the first of Germany's spring offensives. Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's battle, Germany's last gamble to win the war before American strength became overwhelming. Ludendorff had assembled 76 divisions for the attack, using the troops freed from the Eastern Front after Russia's collapse. The plan was audacious: break through the British lines, drive to the Channel, separate the British and French armies, win the war in weeks. The bombardment lasted 5 hours. Then came the stormtroopers. These were not the mass formations of earlier battles. These were infiltration units, specially trained soldiers moving in small groups, bypassing strong points, penetrating deep into British positions, creating chaos and confusion. They carried light weapons, grenades, flamethrowers, light machine guns. Their job was not to fight, but to disrupt, to spread panic, to open gaps for the follow-up divisions. It worked brilliantly. The British Fifth Army, holding the southern portion of the line, collapsed. Gaps opened. German troops poured through. Within days, the Germans had advanced 40 miles farther than any offensive had achieved since the trenches were first dug. They recaptured territory lost in the Somme battles. They threatened Amiens, the vital railway junction that connected British and French forces. In London, there was genuine panic. Could Britain lose the war? After 3.5 years of sacrifice, after the Somme and Passchendaele, after all the blood and treasure spent, could Germany actually win? General Ferdinand Foch was appointed Supreme Allied Commander, given authority over British, French, and American forces. His first task was to prevent the German breakthrough from becoming a rout. He rushed reserves to threatened sectors. He coordinated defense. Most importantly, he maintained unity of command. The Allies would stand together or fall together. The German advance continued into April. Paris itself came under bombardment from the Kaiser's giant artillery pieces, the Parisierschütz, firing from 75 miles away. These were the largest guns ever built, their barrels so long they drooped in the middle, their shells reaching altitudes where the air was so thin that atmospheric resistance nearly disappeared. When shells landed in Paris, destroying buildings and killing civilians, people initially thought they were being bombed from aircraft. They could not imagine guns firing from such distances. The bombardment terrified Parisians but achieved little militarily. The guns were propaganda weapons, designed to break civilian morale. But Parisians endured, as they had endured for nearly 4 years. Meanwhile, the German offensive was slowing. The same factors that had stopped every offensive for 3 years were reasserting themselves. The attackers outdistanced their supply lines. Artillery could not be moved forward fast enough to support advancing infantry. The defenders rushed reinforcements to threatened sectors faster than attackers could exploit breakthroughs. And the Germans themselves were exhausted, having advanced farther in weeks than they had moved in years. There was another factor, one the German High Command had not anticipated. The German soldiers, who had been on short rations for months due to the Allied blockade, found themselves in captured British supply dumps. Here was white bread, real coffee, chocolate, tinned meat luxuries German civilians had not seen in years. The soldiers, They stopped to eat. They got drunk on captured wine and spirits. They marveled at the abundance. How could Germany be winning the war when the enemy had so much and Germany had so little? The looting and eating cost precious time. Discipline frayed. Ludendorff launched more offensives. Operation Georgette in April, targeting the British in Flanders. Operation Blücher in May, striking at the French along the Aisne. Each achieved initial success. Each eventually stalled. The Allies bent but did not break. By June, the German army had expended its strength. The offensives had cost 800,000 casualties, men Germany could not replace. The Allies had suffered equal losses, but American troops were arriving at 250,000 per month. The arithmetic was inexorable. Time, which Germany had been racing against, had run out. On July 15th, Ludendorff launched what would be Germany's final offensive. Near Reims, German troops attacked across the Marne River, the same ground where Germany had been stopped in 1914. But this time, the French knew the attack was coming. They evacuated their forward trenches, letting German artillery pound empty ground. When German infantry advanced, they were caught in well-prepared killing zones. 3 days later, Foch counterattacked. French and American troops, supported by tanks, struck the flanks of the German salient. The Germans, overextended and exhausted, fell back. It was the turning point. The last German offensive had failed. Now came the Allied turn. What followed would be called the 100 Days Offensive, though it actually lasted longer. From August 8th, 1918, until the armistice on November 11th, the Allies advanced steadily, relentlessly, driving the Germans back toward their own border. The offensive began at Amiens on August 8th. Canadian and Australian troops, considered the best assault forces in the British Army, attacked in early morning fog. 450 tanks supported them. The Germans, who had no reserves and no warning, collapsed. The British advanced 8 miles on the first day, an unthinkable distance by Western Front standards. Ludendorff would call it the Black Day of the German Army. But it was not a breakthrough in the old sense. The Allies had learned. They did not pursue exhausted attacks beyond their artillery support. When an offensive stalled in one sector, they attacked in another. It was called bite and hold. Take limited objectives, consolidate, move your artillery forward, attack again. Methodical, unspectacular, effective. The Germans fell back to the Hindenburg Line, the massive fortification system they had built in 1917, considered impregnable. Deep belts of barbed wire, concrete bunkers, elaborate trench systems, carefully sighted machine gun positions. If anywhere could stop the Allied advance, it was here. On September 29th, British and American forces attacked the Hindenburg Line. They used tanks, aircraft, artillery, in unprecedented coordination. The creeping barrage artillery fire that advanced at walking pace ahead of the infantry had been perfected. Aircraft spotted for artillery and strafed German positions. Tanks crushed wire and suppressed machine guns. Infantry followed in small groups, using infiltration tactics learned from the Germans themselves. The Hindenburg Line cracked. Within days, it had fallen. German troops, who had believed this fortress would save them, retreated in disorder. Not everywhere. In many sectors, German units fought with skill and courage, conducting fighting retreats, making the Allies pay for every mile. But the trend was clear. Germany was being pushed back. Away from the Western Front, Germany's allies were collapsing. Bulgaria, facing Allied forces advancing from Greece, signed an armistice on September 29th. The Ottoman Empire, reeling from defeats in Palestine and Mesopotamia, signed on October 30th. Austria-Hungary, disintegrating from within, signed on November 3rd. Germany stood alone. But Germany was not just losing on the battlefield. It was disintegrating from within. The German Navy, which had spent most of the war in port, received orders for one final sortie against the British. It was to be a death ride, a last gesture of defiance. The sailors refused. Why should they die in the war's final days for a gesture of aristocratic honor? The mutiny spread from ship to ship. By November, the red flag of revolution flew over the German fleet. The sailors' mutiny sparked revolution across Germany. In Bavaria, a socialist republic was proclaimed. In Berlin, workers struck and demonstrated. The Kaiser, that pompous figure who had helped start the war, fled to Holland. Socialist politicians proclaimed a republic from the windows of the Reichstag. Germany sought an armistice. President Wilson's 14 points offered the framework: no annexations, self-determination for peoples, a peace without victory. It sounded generous. The reality would be different. But for now, Germany grasped at Wilson's promises like a drowning man reaching for a rope. The armistice negotiations took place in a railway car in Compiègne Forest, north of Paris. Marshal Foch represented the Allies. A German delegation, led by Matthias Erzberger, a civilian politician, came to hear the terms, not to negotiate. To hear the terms and sign or face continued war. The terms were harsh. Germany must evacuate all occupied territory in France, Belgium, and Alsace-Lorraine, surrender vast quantities of military equipment, allow Allied occupation of the Rhineland, maintain the naval blockade until a final peace treaty. Essentially, Germany must disarm before knowing what peace terms would be. The German delegation protested. Foch was unmoved. These were not peace terms, he made clear. This was an armistice, a ceasefire. Peace would come later. Sign or the war continues. At 5 o'clock in the morning on November 11th, 1918, Erzberger signed the armistice. It would take effect at 11 o'clock, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Word spread along the front. In 6 hours, the war would end. 6 hours. Men who had survived 4 years of war now had to survive 6 more hours. Some soldiers celebrated, breaking out hoarded bottles, singing, dancing. Others simply sat in stunned silence, unable to believe it was finally over. Some wept, and some kept fighting. Officers who wanted their men to advance to more favorable positions before the ceasefire. Soldiers who wanted one more chance to kill the enemy. Artillery batteries that fired off all their remaining ammunition. Patrols that went out knowing the war would end before they returned. The last soldier to die in the war was an American, Henry Gunther, killed at 10:59, 1 minute before the armistice took effect, shot by German machine gunners as he charged their position. Why did he charge? No one knows. Perhaps he did not believe the war would actually end. Perhaps he wanted to prove something. Perhaps in the madness of 4 years of war, 1 more minute seemed no different from any other. At 11 o'clock, the guns fell silent. After 1,500 days of continuous fire, the Western Front was quiet. Soldiers on both sides climbed out of their trenches and stood on the parapets, looking across no man's land at the men who had been trying to kill them. Some waved, some shouted greetings, some simply stared, unable to comprehend that they were still alive, that the war was over, that they had survived when so many had not. In London, crowds filled the streets, cheering, dancing, celebrating. In Paris, joy mixed with exhaustion and grief. In New York, ticker tape filled the air. In Berlin, there was relief, but also shock, confusion, anger. How could Germany have lost? The army was still fighting on enemy soil. No Allied soldier stood on German territory. Yet somehow, Germany had been defeated. The soldiers began the long journey home, by train, by truck, on foot. They brought with them memories they would carry forever. Faces of friends who had died, sounds of artillery that would echo in their nightmares, the smell of gas, of mud, of death. They had survived, but they were not the same men who had departed in 1914. Europe began counting the cost. 9 million soldiers dead, 21 million wounded, many crippled for life. Countless civilians dead from fighting, from starvation, from disease. An entire generation of young men decimated. In France, 1 in 5 men of military age was dead. In Germany, similar proportions. In Russia, the numbers were uncountable, war deaths blending into civil war deaths. The physical destruction was vast. Northern France and Belgium were moonscapes, scarred by craters, poisoned by chemicals, littered with unexploded shells that would kill farmers for decades to come. Villages had disappeared entirely, their locations marked only on maps. Cities were in ruins, railways were destroyed, bridges were gone, but the deeper destruction was to faith itself, faith in progress, in civilization, in the goodness of humanity. Europe had been the center of world civilization, the height of human achievement, and Europe had devoured itself. The structures that should have prevented war, international law, treaties, economic interdependence had failed completely. The leaders who should have been wise had been fools. The systems that should have limited violence had instead industrialized it. The soldiers knew this better than anyone. They had seen what civilization meant when you stripped away its pretenses. They had seen educated men using science to devise better ways to kill. They had seen Christian nations praying to the same God while slaughtering each other. They had seen the future, and it was mechanical, impersonal, efficient death. Many would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand what they had experienced, trying to explain to those who had not been there what it meant to live in the trenches, to go over the top, to see friends torn apart by shells. Most would fail. The gap between those who had experienced the war and those who had not could never be fully bridged. The war to end all wars, they would call it. Surely humanity would never again embrace such madness. Surely the lesson had been learned at such terrible cost. It was a beautiful hope, a necessary hope perhaps to make sense of so much suffering, but it was a false hope. The seeds of the next war were already being planted in the harsh terms of the armistice, in the humiliation of Germany, in the promises made and broken, in the lines drawn on maps by men who did not understand the lands they were dividing. For now, though, the guns were silent. The war was over, and that was enough. That had to be enough. The survivors went home to a world that would never be the same. On January 18th, 1919, representatives of the victorious powers gathered in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. It was a calculated choice of venue. This was the same room where, in 1871, following France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, the German Empire had been proclaimed. Bismarck had stood in this very hall and announced the birth of unified Germany while French humiliation was still fresh. Now, 48 years later, France would have its revenge in the same place. The peace conference was dominated by 3 men. Georges Clemenceau of France, 77 years old, called the Tiger, who had twice seen German armies invade his country. David Lloyd George of Britain, the Welsh wizard, politician and pragmatist, who had promised to squeeze Germany until the pips squeak. And Woodrow Wilson of America, the idealistic professor turned president who believed this war could birth a new world order based on democracy and international law. They could not have been more different. Clemenceau wanted security, wanted Germany crushed so thoroughly it could never threaten France again. He had seen the devastation of northern France, had walked through villages that no longer existed, had looked at casualty lists that included 1.5 million French dead. He cared nothing for Wilson's idealism. France needed guarantees written in steel and territorial concessions, not pretty words about self-determination. Lloyd George occupied a middle position. Britain needed Germany weakened but not destroyed. Germany was a counterweight to France, a trading partner, a nation that, if humiliated too severely, might become either Bolshevik or revanchist. Britain had won the war, but could not afford to win a peace that destabilized all of Europe. Wilson arrived in Europe like a messiah. Crowds lined the streets of Paris, London, and Rome to see him. They believed he represented something new, a power that had entered the war not for territory or revenge but for principle. Wilson's 14 points promised self-determination, no secret treaties, freedom of the seas, a League of Nations that would prevent future wars. It was a vision of international order based on justice rather than power. The reality of the peace conference would destroy most of Wilson's ideals. Germany was not invited to the conference. For 5 months, the Allies debated among themselves what terms to impose. When they finally summoned a German delegation in May, it was not to negotiate but to receive the treaty and sign it. The Germans protested. This was not peace, they argued. This was diktat, dictation by the victors. The Allies were unmoved. Germany had imposed harsh terms on Russia at Brest-Litovsk. Germany had devastated Belgium and northern France. Germany had started the war, at least that was the Allied narrative, and it would be written into the treaty itself. Germany must pay. The Treaty of Versailles, which the German delegation signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was designed to ensure Germany could never again threaten Europe. Germany lost 13% of its territory, including Alsace-Lorraine, to France, significant areas to the newly resurrected Poland, and all its colonies. The German army was limited to 100,000 men with no tanks, no aircraft, no heavy artillery. The German navy was reduced to a coastal defense force. The Rhineland would be demilitarized and occupied by Allied forces for 15 years. But the most controversial clause was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Germany and its allies, the treaty stated, bore sole responsibility for starting the war. Therefore, Germany must pay reparations for all civilian damage caused by the war. The amount was not specified in the treaty but would be determined later. It would eventually be set at 132 billion gold marks, a sum so large that Germany would still be making payments into the 21st century. The German delegation, led by Foreign Minister Hermann Müller, signed the treaty with hands that shook with rage and humiliation. Müller would say that he signed it the way a condemned man accepts his death sentence. Germany had no choice. The alternative was resumption of the war, and Germany had no army left to fight. The Treaty of Versailles was a peace that pleased no one. Clemenceau thought it too lenient. Germany should have been broken into smaller states, permanently occupied, reduced to permanent second-class status. Many British thought it too harsh, that it would create lasting resentment. Wilson was deeply disappointed. His 14 points had been compromised one by one. Italy had been promised territory. Japan had been given German concessions in China. France had insisted on crushing reparations. The peace looked less like a new world order and more like traditional power politics dressed in new rhetoric. In Germany, the treaty was seen as a betrayal. German armies had been fighting on enemy soil when the armistice was signed. No Allied soldier stood on German territory. How then had Germany lost? The answer, many Germans came to believe, was that Germany had been stabbed in the back by socialists and Jews who had undermined the war effort from within. This myth, the Dolchstoßlegende, would poison German politics for decades and provide fuel for extremist movements. One German corporal, recovering from gas poisoning in a military hospital when the armistice was announced, wept with rage when he heard the news. His name was Adolf Hitler, and the Treaty of Versailles would become his obsession. Everything he would do, Every speech he would give, every aggressive action he would take, would be justified as reversing the injustice of Versailles. But Versailles was only one of several treaties that reshaped Europe. Austria-Hungary, that ancient patchwork empire, was carved into multiple nation-states. Austria itself was reduced to a small German-speaking core, forbidden from uniting with Germany. Hungary became independent, but lost 2/3 of its territory. Czechoslovakia was created, uniting Czechs and Slovaks with significant German and Hungarian minorities. Yugoslavia emerged, uniting Serbs, Croats and Slovenes in a South Slav state that would prove fractious from the start. Poland was resurrected after over a century of partition, given a corridor to the sea that separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. These new nations were called nation-states, suggesting ethnic homogeneity, but they were nothing of the sort. Czechoslovakia contained 3 million Germans. Poland contained millions of Ukrainians and Germans. Yugoslavia was a mix of ethnicities, religions, and historical grievances. The principle of self-determination, so loudly proclaimed, was applied selectively and imperfectly. Borders were drawn to reward allies and punish enemies, with little regard for the people who would have to live within them. The Ottoman Empire was dismembered. The Turkish heartland became the Republic of Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who fought a war of independence to prevent the carving up of Anatolia itself. But the Arab lands of the Ottoman Empire were divided between Britain and France, according to the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement drawn up during the war. Britain received mandates over Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. France received mandates over Syria and Lebanon. These were not colonies. Technically, the League of Nations called them mandates, territories to be guided towards self-government. But to the Arabs who had fought alongside T.E. Lawrence, who had been promised independence, the mandates looked exactly like colonialism under a new name. The borders drawn by British and French officials, often with rulers and red pencils on maps in London and Paris, paid no attention to tribal, ethnic, or religious realities on the ground. Iraq combined Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, and Kurds in an unstable mix. Syria included numerous ethnic and religious minorities. Palestine, promised both to Jews in the Balfour Declaration and to Arabs through various wartime promises, became a cauldron of competing nationalisms. Lawrence of Arabia, that romantic hero of the Desert Campaign, attended the Paris Peace Conference and watched with growing horror as the promises made to Arabs were broken. He would spend the rest of his life tormented by the knowledge that he had helped Arabs fight for an independence that Britain never intended to grant. 7 Pillars of Wisdom, his magnificent memoir, is as much confession as adventure story. The peace settlement created a Middle East that would know little peace. The artificial borders, the broken promises, the imposition of Western control over Arab lands, planted seeds that would grow into conflict still raging a century later. Meanwhile, a plague was sweeping the world. The Spanish flu, misnamed because neutral Spain, not subject to wartime censorship, reported it openly while other nations' suppressed news had begun spreading in 1918. It probably originated in Kansas at a military training camp and was carried around the world by soldiers and refugees. This was not ordinary flu. It killed with horrifying speed, sometimes within hours of first symptoms, and it killed the young and healthy, those in the prime of life, whose robust immune systems turned against them in cytokine storms. The very people who had survived the war fell to disease. The pandemic swept through the trenches in the war's final months. It ravaged the peace conference. Wilson himself fell ill, possibly affecting his judgment during crucial negotiations. It spread to every continent, every nation. Before it ended in 1920, it had killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people, more than the war itself had killed in 4 years. Think about that. 4 years of industrial warfare, using every deadly innovation of the modern age, killed 9 million soldiers and perhaps 10 million civilians. 18 months of a disease killed 3 to 5 times as many people. It was as if nature itself was adding an exclamation point to the war's lesson about human mortality and the fragility of civilization. The flu killed in places the war never reached. Pacific Islands lost significant portions of their populations. Villages in Alaska were nearly wiped out. In India, millions died. The global death toll dwarfed the war's casualties, yet the flu would be largely forgotten, overshadowed by the dramatic violence of the war itself. As 1919 became 1920, soldiers were finally going home, but home had changed, and they had changed. Women who had worked in factories during the war were not content to return to purely domestic roles. The suffrage movement, fueled by women's wartime service, achieved victories in Britain, Germany, and the United States. The old certainties about gender roles had been shaken. The returning soldiers carried trauma that had no name. Shell shock, they called it, or war neurosis, what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Men who seemed physically fine would suddenly collapse, unable to function. They would wake screaming from nightmares. They would shake uncontrollably. Some were institutionalized, subjected to harsh treatments designed to restore their manhood. Others suffered in silence, self-medicating with alcohol, unable to explain to wives and mothers what they had experienced. Some channeled their experience into art. In Germany, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner painted traumatized soldiers and prostitutes in violent colors. Otto Dix created etchings of trench warfare that were almost unbearable to view. In Britain, poets like Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves wrote bitterly of the war's futility. Wilfred Owen's poems, published posthumously, he died just days before the armistice stripped away all romantic illusions about war. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, Owen wrote, quoting the old Latin phrase, "It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country." Then he described a man dying from gas, drowning in his own fluids. The old lie, he called that Latin phrase. A generation of soldiers agreed. In Germany, other veterans turned to politics. The Freikorps, paramilitary units of ex-soldiers, fought against communists in the streets. From their ranks would come many early members of the Nazi Party. Hitler began giving speeches in Munich beer halls, blaming Jews and communists for Germany's defeat, promising to restore German greatness. Few took him seriously yet, but the ingredients for disaster were mixing. In Russia, the civil war between Reds and Whites raged until 1922, with foreign intervention from Britain, France, Japan, and the United States complicating matters. The Bolsheviks won, but at tremendous cost. Millions died in the fighting. Millions more died in the famines that followed. The Soviet Union that emerged was paranoid, totalitarian, and determined to spread communist revolution worldwide. The world began erecting memorials to the dead. In London, the cenotaph, the empty tomb, became the focus of Remembrance Day ceremonies. In Paris, the tomb of the unknown soldier was placed beneath the Arc de Triomphe. In Washington, the unknown soldier was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. These symbolic graves honored all the dead whose bodies were never identified, never found, whose graves were marked only as known unto God. In Belgium and France, vast cemeteries were created. Row upon row of white headstones, thousands upon thousands of them, each marking a life cut short. The American cemetery at Belleau Wood, the British cemetery at Tyne Cot with its 12,000 graves, the French ossuary at Douaumont, containing the bones of 130,000 unidentified soldiers, French and German mixed together in death as they had been in battle. Every village in France erected its memorial, listing the names of local men who died. Some villages lost so many that the lists of names seemed impossibly long for such small communities. Walking through rural France today, you can see these memorials in every town square, and the dates tell the story. 1914, 1915, 1916, 1917, 1918. 4 years of names. Britain instituted the 2-minute silence on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. For 2 minutes, the entire nation would stop and remember. Traffic halted. Factories ceased work. People stood in silence, heads bowed, thinking of fathers, brothers, sons who would never return. The poppy became the symbol of remembrance, inspired by John McCrae's poem In Flanders Fields, where poppies grew among the graves. On Remembrance Day, people wore paper poppies, red as blood, as bright as the flowers that had covered the battlefields in spring, blooming in soil enriched by the bodies of the dead. The war created a generation of artists and writers obsessed with modernism, with breaking from the past. How could anyone create traditional art after experiencing such horror? The old forms seemed inadequate, even complicit. Dada rejected reason itself. Reason had led to industrial slaughter. Surrealism explored the unconscious mind's dark landscapes. Expressionism used distorted forms to convey psychological trauma. Jazz, born in the war's chaos, rejected traditional harmonies for something raw and immediate. Ernest Hemingway, who had driven ambulances on the Italian front, developed his spare, understated prose style as a reaction to the inflated rhetoric that had sent men to die for empty phrases. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote of the lost generation, young people adrift in a world whose values had been destroyed. T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land depicted a sterile, fragmented civilization unable to create meaning from its own ruins. The war had accomplished something unprecedented. It had disillusioned an entire generation about the nature of civilization itself. Before 1914, educated Europeans believed in progress, in reason, in the essential goodness of Western civilization. The war revealed that civilization was a thin veneer over barbarism, that progress could mean more efficient killing, that reason could devise poison gas and machine guns. This disillusionment would shape the 20th century. It would fuel nihilism and extremism. It would make fascism and communism appealing to people seeking alternatives to a liberal order that had failed so catastrophically. It would create a cynicism about international institutions and grand promises that persists to this day. In France, Marshal Foch looked at the Treaty of Versailles and made a prophecy. "This is not peace," he said. "It is an armistice for 20 years. He was off by 65 days. Almost exactly 20 years after the Treaty of Versailles was signed, Germany would invade Poland and the world would be at war again. The Second World War would kill 50 million people, dwarf the First World War in destructiveness, and culminate in atomic weapons and the Holocaust. All the hopes of 1918 that this had been the war to end all wars, that humanity had learned its lesson, that such madness would never be repeated, all those hopes proved false. The peace that followed the Great War was not really peace at all. It was a pause, a breathing space before the next catastrophe. And yet, standing at the memorials, reading the names carved in stone, one cannot help but honor those who served. They were not responsible for the decisions that led to war. They did not design the strategies that sacrificed them by the hundreds of thousands for minimal gains. They were ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, doing their duty as they understood it. They showed courage, not just in battle but in endurance, the ability to live in trenches, to face death daily, to maintain humanity in the midst of industrialized slaughter that required a courage most of us will never be tested to show. They showed loyalty to their comrades, that bond of shared suffering that transcended national boundaries. The Christmas truce of 1914, when enemies met as human beings, revealed something beautiful about humanity, even in war's ugliness. They were victims and participants, killers and killed, heroes and casualties of forces beyond their control. Remembering them means acknowledging all of this complexity, refusing the easy narratives of glory or futility, seeing them as the complicated, flawed, courageous human beings they were. The Great War, the First World War, the war that was supposed to end all wars, it remains a warning. It shows how easily civilization can collapse, how quickly rational people can embrace madness, how alliances and nationalism and miscalculation can create disasters no one intended. It shows the danger of military plans that leave no room for diplomacy, of political systems that cannot back down without appearing weak, of rhetoric that makes compromise impossible. A century later, the lessons remain relevant. The world is still divided by nationalism. Military alliances still bind nations together. Technology still makes war more destructive. The temptation to believe that this time will be different, that a quick war can solve problems, remains. The poppies still bloom in Flanders fields. The cemeteries still stretch in endless rows. The memorials still bear their lists of names. And if we are wise, we will remember what they mean. Not glory, not adventure, not the triumph of our side over theirs, but the terrible cost of failing to find another way, the price of letting diplomatic disputes escalate to military conflict, the consequences of forgetting that the soldiers dying on both sides are human beings with families, dreams, and lives that matter. The guns fell silent on November 11th, 1918, but their echo continues, in the borders drawn on maps, in the grievances nursed across generations, in the memorials that dot the landscape, in the bones still emerging from the earth when construction disturbs old battlefields. The First World War did not end all wars. It did not make the world safe for democracy. It did not create lasting peace. But it did create this, a profound reminder of what can happen when nations forget that peace, however imperfect, is precious. That compromise, however unsatisfying, beats destruction. That the lives of ordinary people matter more than national pride or strategic advantage. If we remember that, truly remember it, not just on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, but every day, then perhaps something meaningful can be salvaged from the wreckage of 1914 to 1918. Perhaps the dead, those millions whose names are carved in stone or lost forever to history, will not have died entirely in vain. Perhaps we can honor them best, not with monuments, but with choices, by choosing negotiation over ultimatum, cooperation over competition, peace over the terrible seduction of war. The poppies bloom, the names endure, the lesson remains, if we are willing to learn it, lest we forget.